Right, I'm Chris Faulkner with the Prince Mohammed bin Fahd Center here at UCF. I'm here with Dr. James Gibson, Sauer's professor at Washington University, St. Louis, also affiliated with Stellenbosch University in South Africa. So welcome, Dr. Gibson. Thank you for being here. Have a few questions just to talk about our topic of tolerance and education. So could you maybe talk a little bit about your book, Overcoming Apartheid? Can Truth Reconcile a Divided Nation?
Yes, I'll be happy to. That book is actually the second book in what's come to be known as the Overcoming Trilogy. It's a series of 3 books, all with overcoming as their first word, and all referring to a particular portion of the problem of democratization in South Africa at the time at which I wrote the book. So Overcoming Apartheid really is a book about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and whether that process was successful in producing truth and whether truth actually contributes to reconciliation. And the short answer is it does, sometimes with some people.
Okay. Well, great. So how might the lessons learned in South Africa, and specifically what you've learned from your research on these Truth and Reconciliation kind of commissions, be applicable to maybe the current climate in the U.S. regarding at least the maybe perceived or real degree of intolerance that is made public in all the media outlets that we see?
Right. Well, let me begin by distinguishing 2 kinds of justice. The first is victor's justice, and it characterized what happened after World War II, and that's where the victors punish the vanquished, but do very little to punish for their own misdeeds. In South Africa, the Truth Commission took the view that gross human rights violations ought to be acknowledged no matter what the motive was for the motivation. So those who struggled against apartheid but who bombed civilian populations were condemned at the same way that those who struggled on behalf of apartheid and committed gross human rights violations. So this notion of equal justice, this notion of blaming all sides for the atrocities that they committed, is what caused every segment of South Africa to buy into and grant legitimacy to the Truth and Reconciliation process. Had it been a process by which whites were condemned for all the sins of apartheid, I think it would have failed badly. Had it been a process where the gross human rights violations of blacks were ignored, the process would have failed badly. Most people in the world have a very erroneous view of Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was actually the leader of the military wing of the ANC. And Nelson Mandela ordered attacks on civilian populations. Now, I definitely agree that those attacks spun out of control because Mandela was in Robben Island. But nonetheless, Mandela recognized, and the Truth Commission recognized, that all sides did horrible things. When you blame everybody, then there's a basis for reconciliation. If you only blame those who lose and don't blame those who won, then it's impossible to reconcile.
That's great insight, and I think it speaks well to a point you brought up earlier, and for the viewers, I know this isn't something that they were able to attend, but you talked a little bit about this idea that when talking about tolerance and intolerance, you said that intolerance is natural, and tolerance is something that may be unnatural. And so could you talk maybe a little bit about those who didn't get to view your presentation earlier about this divide or this misconception that might be out there?
Sure. So this idea is actually reasonably well grounded in the psychology of genetics. And those folks argue that fear of the different, which is the definition of xenophobia, has had survival value over time. So if a group is confronted with something that's unusual, their first response is to view it as threatening and to strike out at that which is threatening. Now, I agree that you can make an opposite argument. You can actually make the argument that welcoming new things has survival value because innovation is enhanced. But I think the weight of evidence is, especially from neuropsychology, is that we have an extraordinarily well developed surveillance system. So we're always looking for threat out in our environment. And when we see threat, our first reaction is to want to strike out against it. Tolerance is a hard idea. So why in the world should we allow the Ku Klux Klan to put up a sign saying we're cleaning the highway? Why don't you like us for cleaning the highway? Why should we allow people we hate whose ideas are despicable to us? Why should we allow those ideas to be expressed? And I think the answer is one that requires a great deal of thought, a great deal of thinking, a great deal of reading about what philosophers have said and so on. So the only way I get to tolerance is to stop and think. So I see a Nazi flag, and boy, I'd really like to get the Nazis. But then I stop and think to myself, well, if the government can tell the Nazis they can't speak, maybe the government tomorrow will tell me that I can't speak. Or a whole series of reasons. Maybe we ought to let the Nazis speak so people can see how truly stupid they are, and maybe give them a microphone so it defeats their cause. So it takes a certain amount of intellectual ability, a certain amount of experience with fairly complicated thinking to arrive at a tolerant position. And unless one has some training in doing that, it's hard to get there.
Yeah, okay. You spoke a little bit earlier about this idea that greater education leads to more tolerance. And I know in the South African case, which you've referenced, that wasn't necessarily the case. And could you explain why greater education did not lead to more tolerance?
Yes. You know, from the beginning, and the beginning, by the way, is actually the Iowa studies in the 1930s, where people were studying ways to inculcate democratic values through the schools. From the very beginning, that body of research suggested that the style of teaching was perhaps more important than the substance that was taught. And here's what I mean by that. Participatory learning where the truth is not presented on a plate and I ask you to accept it lock, stock, and barrel, but rather the truth is presented as something that we have to discover together, we have to think about together. Well, in South African schools, there was no idea that the student and the teacher would be in any way intellectually equal. What people were being taught is first Afrikaans, the language of apartheid, so that they could serve white people in the language of the dominant white people. But then they were taught to be servile. They weren't taught the universal declarations of the rights of man. They were taught what kind of Clorox would get a stain out of clothes, or how to garden effectively. So it's the style of education primarily, and it's the absence of any degree of liberalism in the South African school system that impeded the development of political tolerance, or more generally, democratic values.
Right. And I like this kind of metaphor you used earlier, the idea of being a reverse alchemist.
Yes.
And it's a clever term. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what that means, and specifically what that means when it comes to this topic that we're discussing here when it comes to tolerance.
Of course, the alchemist tried for decades, actually almost a century, to turn lead into gold. And my work has taught me how to turn gold into lead. And here's specifically what I mean by that. we want people to give a sober second thought. So I say to you, will you tolerate the Ku Klux Klan? And you, without thinking very much, will say, no way, man. I don't want to allow them to do anything. And then I come back and say to you, well, think about it for a minute. And so I present a counter argument to you. So I may say, well, you know, the Klan really ought to be allowed to put the sign up on the highway because, after all, any group, it's not a violent activity. Anybody ought to be able to do that out of a norm of equality and reciprocity. So what I'm trying to do is induce you to think about a second value and juxtapose it with your initial inclination to not to tolerate. Well, unfortunately for me, I can turn tolerance into intolerance at 3 times the rate that I can turn intolerance into tolerance. Let me say that slightly differently. I can convince very easily people to abandon their tolerance, but it's very difficult to convince people to abandon their intolerance. And so that leads me to believe that intolerance has a whole bunch of psychological attributes that make it impervious to change, whereas tolerance has the opposite attributes that make it relatively malleable and susceptible to change.
Awesome. So how does this, more general, how does this work with, for a U.S. perspective, you know, thinking about maybe the volatility of the political climate with the new administration?
Yes.
And maybe you can speak a little bit about how the perceived intolerance with this reverse maybe in this reverse alchemist way, that you can really get people to become intolerant quickly, and what this new administration or the political climate now means for that.
Yes. This is actually a lesson I learned in the 1970s from the efforts of the Nazis to hold a march in Skokie, Illinois, but it's a lesson that pertains with equal relevance to today. What you have to do is slow down the process to give people time to think, to be exposed to different kinds of arguments. So if it's the mob taking folks off to the guillotine, there's not much time for thought, for debate, for thinking about the consequences and so on. So you have to slow down the process. Well, how do you do that? In the American case, you file a lawsuit. So in the case of Skokie, a lawsuit was filed and the case was not decided for a year. That opened the door for people to calm down a little bit, to think about all of the consequences. With the Trump travel ban, what's the first thing that happened? A lawsuit was filed. And that first process played out relatively slowly. The subsequent travel ban is going to play out over a longer period of time, and it allows for deliberation. And with deliberation comes the possibility of change, not the guarantee of change, but comes the possibility of change. And so my argument is quite contrary to many politicians. And my argument is get judges involved, because it slows things down and gives people time to think about the consequences of their initial position.
Great. And I want to wrap up maybe with one final question. And you've alluded to it already in one of your answers, but you talked about this idea that maybe more tolerance of opposing viewpoints is actually associated with greater perceptions of freedom. And I know in a previous discussion you referenced this to African Americans' perspective when it comes to racist viewpoints.
Yes.
So could you maybe just wrap up with some discussion about this?
Yes. This is actually a finding that I published, unfortunately, in an obscure journal because I was obliged to as a result of a conference. So it was published in Political Geography, but here's the finding. So we measure people's perceptions of freedom. So we say to them, I'm doing this in stylized form. We say, how free do you feel to express your viewpoints around here? Do you feel free to wear a lapel pin supporting a candidate? A whole series of questions. So we measure perceived freedom, not actual freedom necessarily, but the freedom that people perceive is available to them. Then we've measured the degree of political tolerance of the community within which people live. And one of the measures is, would you tolerate someone who's making the argument that blacks are genetically inferior? So one might think that where the argument that blacks are genetically inferior is more widely expressed because it's tolerated, that blacks would feel less free. They do not. It's exactly in the opposite direction. Tolerance of racist speech is associated with black people feeling more free, not less free. Well, that doesn't ring true. That seems like it makes no sense. But there's a relatively simple answer, and that is where tolerance of racist speech exists, tolerance of all kinds of speech exists. Indeed, where you tolerate an extreme viewpoint, that liberates all less extreme viewpoints to be expressed and tolerated in the community. I'm not saying for a second that black people profit from hearing racist arguments. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is where you tolerate things like racist, you tolerate everything else. And where you tolerate everything, people feel more free, even if some of the things that they hear, they disapprove of, they regard as insulting, and so on.
I think that's great insight, and we really appreciate you coming and giving your talk earlier and then sitting down with me for a little bit with some questions. So thank you again for your time, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Happy to do so. It's been a great visit.